Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Tonight, a big night, and we're on top of two huge stories, both involving who else but President Trump. Now, 3 hours from now, the president, he'll be delivering his State of the Union address. It will come as we are facing yet another government shutdown just 10 days from now, unless Congress can make a deal that the president will sign. In fact, the State of the Union was delayed a week over the shutdown. And as usual, money for the border wall, it is the principal sticking point. Now, we will be back live at 9 o'clock to broadcast the entire address. Then we will be following it with both the rebuttal from the Democrats and then analysis immediately thereafter. Now, the president, he will deliver his address with yet another legal cloud hanging over his head. Now, his Inauguration Committee has been subpoenaed by federal prosecutors as that investigation ramps up. In a few minutes, we will be speaking with the former federal prosecutor to break down what this means, but many are saying this could be one of the most significant developments since this investigation has started. But first, we get to the big speech. The White House says it will be a call for unity. You heard me right. But both sides, they can't seem to agree on just about anything. Now, here are Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Minority Leader Chuck Schumer.
From historic tax reform and regulatory reform to huge progress in the fight against ISIS, to landmark progress in the nationwide fight against opioid addiction, the story of the last 2 years has been one of immense policy progress.
President Trump will say tonight that the state of our union is strong, but the American people know the truth. On the economy, health care, governance, foreign policy, it's abundantly clear that the Trump administration has been failing the middle class in this country. What is the state of the Trump economy? Failing the middle class.
Now, again, as I said off the top, the president's preaching motto tonight will be unity. But if you think you're going to get a new, kinder president who will turn the other cheek, think again. He couldn't let that last comment from Senator Schumer go by, so he responded with, of course, a tweet. Here goes. Quote, "I see Schumer's already criticizing my State of the Union speech, even though he hasn't seen it yet. He's just upset that he didn't win the Senate after spending a fortune like he thought he would." There's the Donald we know. All right, now, speaking of Washington, let's head to our nation's capital, where our senior political correspondent Andrew Whitman has been talking to lawmakers all day. Andrew?
Hi, Rich, and good evening from Capitol Hill. You know, you do this enough, you cover enough State of the Union addresses as you and I both have, and you can find that there's a continuing pattern with lawmakers as you're talking to them on State of the Union Day. It's always positive, always a lot of sunshine. The State of the Union is strong, but if we could just get over our little differences between one party or the other, or give a little or take a little in one direction, everything will be fine. And that was the case with most of the lawmakers that I've spoken with today. Not so with Senator Chris Murphy, the Democrat from Connecticut. I asked him about the State of the Union and about his views on partisanship, as well as the president's calls for greater unity and bipartisanship tonight. He was a little more cutting in some of his comments. We want to play them for you right now. It is State of the Union night. How would you describe the state of our union?
Well, listen, the state of our union is weaker than it has been in a long time. The threats this president has posed to basic democratic norms are very, very concerning to me. But I think we can survive this president. I think this country just has to hold on for another 2 years, and we'll get back to some degree of normalcy. The state of our union is weaker than it has been, but I think we can persevere through this.
I'm sure you saw the poll, I think it was CNN late last week, that said 42 or 43% of Americans think that this is the least effective government in their lifetimes at governing. And that's an indictment of all three branches. I would assume the question didn't specify. What's your reaction to that and to people who, I'm sure you hear their frustration with how Washington works or how it doesn't?
You know, you have to pay attention to basic competence when you elect leaders. And unfortunately, we have a president who doesn't know details, who spends most of his time watching cable news, who doesn't know how to compromise. Ideology matters, but you also need to select people who just know how to run government, and maybe people will pay more attention to that moving forward.
But for those on the other side of the aisle, they may say, well, but the economy's booming. Look at all these jobs, conservative judge. I mean, how do you respond to people who are saying, yeah, but maybe it's working?
Well, come to my state and ask middle-class families if they think the economy is booming. folks in Connecticut haven't gotten a raise in 20 years. More people are working part-time jobs and temporary jobs than any time before. Nobody can afford college. Nobody's got money for retirement. The idea that the economy is booming just because the unemployment rate is low is false. I'm glad that people have jobs, but if you don't have jobs that pay, if you don't have jobs that allow you to save for college and retirement, then that's not an economy that works for everybody.
The president expected to call for bipartisanship tonight, and I'm reminded that he also called for bipartisanship a year ago in his State of the Union address, and that last week he also basically said to the conference committee, either I get what I want or it's a waste of time. What do you make, what should people at home make of his calls for bipartisanship in the address tonight?
I mean, listen, there's no connection between sort of what the president says and truth anymore. So I'm going to be at the speech out of respect tonight. I'm glad that I have a guest who can communicate some important values from Connecticut. But it almost doesn't matter what the president says tonight, because he'll say something totally different tomorrow and he'll do something totally different the day after. Unfortunately, the words that this president uses are kind of meaningless, and that's really sad for me to say, but it's kind of true.
And as we were watching the comments of Senator Murphy there, I was reminded that there is actually a bipartisan effort underway to try to avert another shutdown, the conference committee that's being chaired by Congresswoman Nita Lowey. So there are efforts at bipartisanship here in Washington as we approach State of the Union time tonight. It just seems like there's a lot of frustration as well, and you're seeing as that's beginning to play out. But I thought some interesting comments there from Senator Murphy. Rich?
And I agree. I've heard some other comments, too. Now, you've been on the Hill all day talking about senators and congresspeople on and off camera. I get a sense from folks that there's a resignation, that the last 2 years are so baked in, that this intentional, at times, disruption and disunity, that they know it's going to be like that the next 2 years, barring the Mueller probe having some bombshell. But people are basically going to hang on till 2020 November, see what changes. But till then, they don't expect anything out of the executive branch other than what they've seen the last 2 years. Is that the sense you get on the ground today?
I think that's a terrific observation, Rich. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you get into routines and patterns when you cover State of the Union. You know you're going to expect to hear certain things from each side as you go into it, and a lot of what your expectations are already baked in. But there seems to be something else that's baked in this go-round, that it's just going to be the same slog, that it's the political equivalent of a 4-day rainy patch where you're just not going to see the sunshine for a while. I mean, that seems to be one of the continuing senses. Nobody's saying that specifically. Nobody's coming up and using that metaphor, but there definitely is a sense that I'm getting. I mean, even Republicans that I've talked to, there's a almost tired of having to answer the same questions and defend the same things. I don't know if that will lead to any substantive changes or changes in how the parties handle these things, but I think you're absolutely dead on with that observation, Rich.
And people forget this, but State of the Unions are that moment where the president, regardless of party, can talk about moonshots, about curing cancer or trying to do some really big things that, at least for that night, we can hope and envision, oh, wow, that's a generational opportunity. Maybe it won't get enacted. Maybe they won't find the funding, but there are ideas. You don't get that tonight. Finally, Andrew, you're going to be joining us later on in the program, and we'll also hear again from Senator Murphy. We spent a lot of time last night talking about that unbelievable story. We've talked at length about family separation in this program, but the unbelievable response from this administration with both an indifference and a shockingly saying putting families back together with children that we separated would be bad for the kids, so we're not going to try. And I'm not exaggerating. Senator Murphy's going to talk about that too.
Yeah, he is, and we'll talk more about that family separation policy. He is certainly appalled by it. Interesting to note that Senator Murphy's guest to the State of the Union address tonight is the leader of an organization that's been helping kids who are, coming from out of the country, whether they're separated from their families or whether they simply have come here individually. So he's really deeply invested in that story, particularly with the guest that he brought here tonight. So we'll hear more from him on that in just a little bit. And also, hopefully, we'll get into a little bit more about the process on this conference committee and whether we can actually prevent a government shutdown as we move forward. Rich?
All right, Andrew. And Andrew will be joined, as we said, here by lawmakers throughout the night in the run-up to the address. And then after the address, we'll, of course, have the entire address from the president, the rebuttal, and also, Andrew, will get live reaction from folks that were in the room here, congressmen and senators. Now, as the president delivers that State of the Union again at 9 o'clock tonight, he does so with falling poll numbers. Only 37% of the American public polled say they approve of the job that he's doing. Nearly 60% disapprove, and think about that, especially in the context of the economy that we're enjoying. Now, joining us to discuss the State of the Union and more, ABC News political director Rick Klein. Rick, I've heard the themes choosing greatness and promoting unity is some of the dominant themes that we should be hearing tonight. But then in the next sentence I hear he's going to give voters a choice between the Democrats veering to socialism versus the president's plan. Is this going to be more of a campaign stump speech here, or is this some, kumbaya where everyone will hold hands at the end of the hour? What are you hearing?
I think it's less of a fresh start than a doubling down from President Trump. We'll hear things about bipartisanship and the need for national unity, but of course the other themes that he hits around policy issues are quite divisive. And I think when he starts talking about his the tax plan, for instance, or health care, certainly the border wall and immigration, that's where the party lines come into pretty sharp focus. So I don't expect that this is a president that 2 years in can suddenly change the narrative of his popularity or the trajectory in Congress.
In a week and a half, the government's set to shut down again if there isn't an agreement. To that end, what do you think, if anything, we hear from the president? Does he talk about declaring an emergency? Where is the appetite from Republicans on that? I mean, it's the elephant in the room. Where does he go with it tonight?
Our understanding is that he's going to stop short of a national emergency, but not rule it out, as he has in the past, that it's in his back pocket at the end of the government funding deadline of 10 days from now. So he could still come back to that, although we don't think it's going to be the first option or an option that he talks about as an affirmative step tonight. He's going to talk about the border crisis, and I think he's done that pretty extensively over the last 6 or 7 weeks, so that shouldn't be a surprise. I'm curious to see if he broadens the conversation at all to bring in other issues that could potentially entice Congress to negotiate with him.
And where is the Republican Party? We've heard that there's been pushback and even some voices saying, listen, you go the declaration of emergency here, there's enough votes here to override even a veto. What's going on behind the scenes in terms of Republicans who aren't comfortable with any president, let alone one potentially in the future being a Democratic one, taking away their power of the purse?
That's just it. The precedent that set the slippery slope is a dangerous one for Republicans. They have bad nightmares of a Democrat saying, you know what, climate change is a national emergency, therefore we need a national carbon tax. So that is what they're trying to avoid. They've been telling the president that. They've been urging him publicly and privately not to go the route of the national emergency. The question for many of them, though, is what they would prefer. If the president is intent on getting that border wall, would they prefer to see a government shutdown, or would they prefer to see a national emergency that may not result in anything because it's going to be tied up in courts anyway?
And that brings me full circle. Nancy Pelosi is going to be sitting over the president's shoulder when he does his address. She's not going to give him a penny for the wall. He says without the wall here, we could see shutdown 2.0. I've seen this play before, Rick, but in the second act, who blinks first again?
Well, it is a test of wills, and last time the president blinked first. I think this time there are ways that he can get out of this staring contest and find a way out that involves that national emergency. No one wants to see a second shutdown. We don't believe he's going to rule that out, though, tonight. So the showdown continues, and I think, at least for tonight, is going to be backburnered until next week.
Finally, Rick, obviously you have the ongoing probe, even more developments, as we've already spoken about this hour. What's the optics going to be like in the room? You get the sense that while he's, rock solid with his base, there's a lot of Republicans uncomfortable what 2020 might bring. Certainly Democrats, he's persona non grata. How do you think, if at all different from previous State of the Unions, what's the vibe in the room tonight? First guess this.
Well, starting with Nancy Pelosi literally and figuratively looming over the president's shoulder, that's different. Looking out into that sea of Democratic presidential contenders, looking out at the Republican senators that have grown frustrated with his leadership. It's a new day in Washington, and it has been for a couple of weeks now, and I think you'll see it on pretty stark display, whether that's what Pelosi crosses her arms on or claps for and what the room does, whether there's any hissing or even laughter at things the president says. All of that, I think, is a risk tonight. It is a very uncivil time to go through the pomp and the pageantry of a State of the Union address.
We're going to learn soon enough. Rick Klein, thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
And up next, everybody, President Trump's inauguration was smaller than others, but it sure had a big budget. In fact, the biggest one by far. Now, the feds, they've subpoenaed the Inaugural Committee. We've got the very latest on this and just how significant this could all be.